Thank you very much for doing this.
My pleasure.
I appreciate it. Why is this 2035 target for net zero, a net zero grid, unrealistic in your view?
Oh, it may be realistic in other provinces, and there are other provinces that are almost already there. Ontario and Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia. But the problem is Alberta is the furthest from it. We have 90% of our power grid that is fueled by natural gas because we made the decision to phase out coal early. We're still paying for that decision. It's cost us billions of dollars, and we thought we would have a certain amount of runway for that investment to get paid back so we don't have stranded assets. So for the federal government to come in and say that we have to phase out that investment early with technology that doesn't exist, and if we don't achieve it by 2035, people start going to jail and getting fines. I have to stand up and say, whoa, let's do something realistic here. Realistic in our province is aiming for a 2050 target, which I've said to the Prime Minister from my very first conversation with him. And so we're working on trying to get the federal government aligned with us on achieving emissions neutrality by 2050.
On the matter of the jail question, we are going to speak with the Federal Minister of Environment, and we'll ask him, we'll put that question to him. We haven't heard federal leaders say that, but...
It's on their website. It says that it could be punishable with jail time.
It'll be a criminal code legislation. Yeah. Under the proposed federal plan, there are 3 new gas plants that are currently being built that will be allowed to operate unabated until 2045. How much, that's 5 years from your deadline for net zero at 2050. How much daylight is there between your plan and the Fed's plan?
Well, there's a big difference between 2035 and 2045, and there's a few reasons.
I guess I'm referring partly to some of the exceptions and the Alberta measures in particular.
Well, to me, the issue is, does the technology exist to achieve what the Feds want to achieve by 2035? They want to have natural gas on the grid if it can be abated at a level of 95%. Now, the technology is pretty good. It's at 65% in Saskatchewan. In talking with people who are expert in this field, they think we can get to 80%. But you have to deal with technology as it exists, innovation as it exists, and nobody's going to take a risk today on going into building abatement technology if they can't be certain that they're going to get to that part. And maybe eventually with incremental improvements we'll get there, but we're certainly not going to be able to get there in 12 years. We may not be able to get there by 2045. It may be that we have to do some other things, that we have to bring on small modular nuclear, for instance. We've got no legislative framework for that in Alberta. We have the work to do to get social license, to identify sites, to create a brand new regulatory process. That's not going to be completed very quickly. And we also know that we have an interest in trying to do interties with other provinces. But building transmission lines is not without controversy and difficulty and a lot of consultation as well. So the 2035 timeframe is just simply too fast. If we can align around 2050 so that we have the ability to be pursuing all these things at once, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, bringing on geothermal and small modular nuclear, also bringing in interties, and then finally, I'm of the view, in talking with industry, that last mile is probably going to be needed to be addressed with things like direct air capture. And we already have some great innovation on that front. Carbon engineering was just bought for $1.2 billion by Occidental on a direct air capture program. Avatar Innovations has 2 finalists in the $100 million Elon Musk X Prize to do direct air capture. And so we know that we need to have all of these different options available to us. If you set an arbitrary timeline before the technology is available, it essentially acts as a bit of a production cap, and we can't have that on electricity.
So you have asked for, you're putting Alberta on track for a goal that's 15 years later, and a lot of the technology, I mean, there's innovation around some of the things you're talking about, but a lot of it is yet unrealized and certainly not ready for prime time. What in 2050 will the grid look like in Alberta, do you expect?
I suspect there'll be a combination. There'll be natural gas abated to the level that's technologically feasible at the time, in addition to direct air capture to cover the offsets. New power will be brought on, hopefully by bringing in interties with our with our neighbors, and we'll also have a framework for small modular nuclear, maybe even large nuclear as well. I think that it's unfamiliar in this part of the country, and so as people become more familiar with the technology, there may be more acceptance. We want to play a role in helping to get that adopted. We gave $7 million in a research grant to Cenovus to figure out how they might be able to roll it out. But remember, small modular nuclear isn't even being rolled out in Eastern Canada until 2026 or 2028. And so we're starting from ground zero. So I believe that once they pave the pathway, once they've developed the technology, once they've developed the approvals, it'll make it easier for the rest of us to develop it. But all of that takes time.
You're confident in small modular nuclear to be part of this in
That's one part of it.
27-year timeline?
Definitely, especially because I think there's such an enthusiasm for it in some of the large industrial projects. I know it's a key part of the Pathways net zero plan to get to carbon neutrality by 2050 with the big oil sands players. And so I think that there's a lot. We've signed on to a memorandum of understanding with Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick. So and we've received early indications that our populace is interested in looking into that. So yeah, I think it will be a part of the plan.
Thinking about affordability, you say the federal plan could quadruple power rates in Alberta. Any grid transition is going to cost money, regardless of the timeline, will require significant investments. Won't ratepayers be on the hook no matter how you go?
Well, the electric system operator gave us an assessment of what it would take to keep up with the demand on our electricity grid by 2050 under a normal scenario, $92 billion. So you'd expect that between now and 2050, that's how much we would end up having to pay. The additional cost of trying to get to a net zero power grid by 2035 is $52 billion. So you go then from taking that amount of money and smooshing it into a 12-year period. That's why it costs so much and why you'd see such a hike. I think the way I've tried to describe this before is I think people understand the concept of capital turnover. You know, if you buy a car today, if I said to you 5 years from now it's going to be illegal, that would cause you real hardship. If I said to you 20 years from now you're not going to be able to drive a combustion engine vehicle, you think, oh, well, 20 years from now I'm probably going to need a new car anyway, so I'll get the best available technology then. That's what we've done to our natural gas producers, is that we gave them the go-ahead on their technology, expecting that they would have a 40-year time frame. And now the rules are being changed and modified, and that's what's creating all of the uncertainty. Is part of the reason why, even though we need to continue to have base load being brought on over these coming couple of decades, nobody's willing to take that risk if they're going to end up facing the kind of severe penalties that we've heard of from the federal level.
Keeping the focus on this matter of the power grid and keeping the lights on, what projects do you hope can now happen in light of the Supreme Court's decision on Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act being deemed largely unconstitutional? Well,
I can tell you, under that act, they asserted that they would have the approval decision on any power plant over 200 megawatts, whereas historically we have always approved those locally. So we'll be able to approve those again, and we will do it with the best efforts of a type of approach. Of course, we're going to want to bring on projects with abatement as part of the discussion, but we're going to work as fast as the technology will be able to keep up. We're not going to be threatening fines and jail time to people if perhaps the incremental improvement isn't where we expect it to be by 2035. We're going to find all types of ways to be able to bring new power on. So that's what I would say, is we're going to be de-risking natural gas. We're going to be de-risking the rollout potentially of small modular nuclear, and we're going to make sure that the number one goal here is that we have a reliable grid, bringing on enough power at the pace that we need to keep electricity affordable. That's our job. That's why the Constitution, Section 92, gives electricity exclusively to the provinces to make decisions over, and we intend to do that.
You're confident it's your purview and your purview alone at this point?
And not just me. There were a bunch of other provinces who stood with us. First Nations stood with us. Business leaders stood with us. And now the Supreme Court of Canada has stood with us as well. And yes, we are going to make sure that we defend our jurisdiction.
I want to talk about the pause on renewables and how that fits into this, wind, solar, and in particular, the deliverable, the work that's being done. What will come out of this pause? What new guidelines for how that sector will work are coming this winter?
There'll be a few things. One will be that people will have to expect that when they're siting their projects, that they do so on marginal lands, that we won't be allowing the development of solar and wind on prime agriculture lands or on lands that are going to interfere with our beautiful viewscapes of the mountains. Those are valuable for tourism, and we have to make sure that we maintain that value as well. We are also going to make sure that there is some kind of bond or fund so that when these projects come to end of life, there is money set aside to be able to pay for them. I'm very concerned that we've already seen some of these projects change hands multiple times, and there isn't a pot of money set aside. And yet each wind turbine, because it has 850 cubic meters of cement at its core, a steel pillar the size of the Calgary Tower, and blades that have to be buried because we don't have a recycling plan for any of those, that is going to be a minimum of $1 million per turbine for it to be reclaimed. So who's going to pay for that at the end of life? We need to make sure that we know the answers to that. So having some kind of fund set aside so that over the lifetime of the productive value of that asset, there's money set aside so that they can reclaim it at the end of life. The other issue, of course, is around intermittency. Our power grid is becoming increasingly unstable. If you go back 20 years, it'd be unusual to have a level 3 alert, which means that you have to start shedding load, otherwise the system will collapse. It would be once a year or once every couple of years. We've had 8 of those in the last year. And when you look at the days where we almost had grid failure, it's because it was either really hot or really cold. And solar wasn't on, or wind wasn't on, or both. There were a couple of those days where wind and solar combined, even though we have 5,000 megawatts of installed power, we're producing less than 100 megawatts of power. So that's what we have to manage the grid for, is that we have to look at what happens on the day where we need to use maximum power, and do we have enough base load dispatchable power in order to be able to meet that demand. We can't just rely on intermittent power. And so we need to be bringing on wind and solar at the same time as we're bringing on base load power. That's the other consideration that we have. And I would like to see solar incentivized in more places like cities, rooftops of buildings, homes. Right now, we charge the same transmission and distribution charge, even though if you put something on your home to provide mostly power for yourself, that doesn't give you much of an incentive if the biggest part of your bill, if there's nothing you can do to reduce it. So those are the kind of policies that we're looking at. And we're only a few more months away from being able to reveal the new approach.
Pause is going to end on time at the end of February?
Absolutely. We are highly motivated to make sure that we create the certainty. And that's why we put the pause in place for only 6 months, is we want people to know under what conditions they'll be investing in all of the different types of options. Would you say the pause in the way you're handling renewables is because of hard lessons learned in the oil and gas industry? There's a couple things. The reason I knew we had to put a pause on wind and solar is I watched the grid fail in Texas. I've watched what's happened in Germany. I talked about the bonds. And things like. Well, I'll just say that there's sort of 2 aspects to it. Is that we now know that we're at a point where we have to make sure that we're bringing that reliability is one aspect. But there's no question that I was a landowner advocate all the way back to the 90s, and I've been talking about this problem that we have of inactive wells for 25 years, and that we need a better solution for it. So we just can't be in a position now where we're making similar mistakes today, knowing that there's a huge liability bill 25 years from now, because I'm going to look back and say, why didn't they do something about that? Didn't they learn anything about when this happened the first time? We've learned. And so we're going to make sure that as we're holding our oil and gas industry to account, because they now are required to pay 3% of their liability down each and every year. They paid down more than $700 million of their liability this year. They'll have to do the same thing next year. Now that we're finally addressing that legacy problem, we've got to be sure that we don't create a brand new problem with a new industry. You wouldn't say that the renewable industry is being punished for the mistakes oil and gas has made? Everybody's got to make sure that they're dealing with the environmental aspects and the environmental impacts. And I'm trying to imagine that farmer 25 years from now looking up at one of those big wind turbines that is no longer active, wondering, how am I going to take care of this? Because in the wind and solar industry, we don't have an orphan wind turbine program or an orphan solar farm program where the existing players pay for the liabilities of the past players. We have a lot of risk that we're asking landowners to bear, and that's not fair. We just have to make sure that they have protection.
Thank you.
Thank you.